Hello everyone, welcome to this session entitled Responses to Polycrises. My name is Konstantinos Tsalakos and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Economic Review. Allow me to immediately introduce our esteemed speakers. From your right to your left, Alexander Cooley, Clerto Professor of Political Sciences and Vice Provost for Research and Academic Centers at Barnard College, Columbia University. Mr. Willem van Duin, former CEO and Chairman of Achmea Executive Board and Chairman of Achmea Foundation. Mrs. Nina Gregori, Executive Director of the European Union Agency for Asylum. And Mr. Yanis Amor, Executive Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Climate School at Columbia University and Assistant Professor of Global Health and Microbiological Sciences. So, Polycrises. When French philosopher and sociologist Edgar Morin first introduced the term during the late 90s, probably he could not have imagined the popularity that the term would have almost 25 years after, referring to not only the simultaneity of more than one crisis, but their entanglement and interaction. The term resurfaced a few years back when we had to face the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy and cost of living crisis, and of course climate change at the same time. Since then, the collective experience of living in a state of cascading and connected crisis seems to become something like a new normal. So, Mr. Cooley, let me start with you. It seems that crises are piling up again, one onto the other, with geopolitics and geoeconomics at the center this time. To what extent do you think that the US is actually fueling some of these crises instead of leading the resolution?
I do think quite a bit, but not just because of the tariff declaration. I think it's important to understand the role that the US has played in other crises, like the great financial crisis of 2008 or the oil shocks. Global crises of large dimensions where the US actively tried to put together some sort of plan or some sort of solution, right? Or some sort of idea forward and play a coordinating role. I would sort of say there's three things that are possibly different right now. One is you have this convergence between US domestic politics and views about the US and the world. Right? Previously, Republicans, Democrats followed a very similar foreign policy. Sometimes they called it the blob, right? The parameters were relatively the same. Over some issue areas, there were differences. But this is a fundamental reorientation where one side actually distrusts governance as a practice. Not even any particular sphere, and we'll talk about those, but just the practice of administration, the deconstruction of the administrative state. So whether this is at the domestic level, the regional level, the global level, this is an issue. The US president himself also is extremely volatile and likes to be quite opaque and untransparent in what he does because he thinks it gives him an advantage, right? So Trump himself, beyond his beliefs, his style is very much about unpredictability. That is the art of the deal, right? And so signaling, building coalitions, thinking strategically, Trump is very much of the short term, and that adds to the challenge. And then I think the other dimension of this, especially thinking about the states, is not just the sort of withdrawal from different sort of global governance, multilateral organizations, and so forth, but also the pulling out of some of the very basic funding of research that documents all of these dimensions of the polycrisis, right? Whether it's global health. Perhaps Yanis will talk about that more, questions of climate change and so forth. So we have this convergence right now in the US that certainly is unlike previous areas where the US was questioned as to what leadership role it would play.
So let me turn to Mr. Ben Amor and begin from something that you said. There is great concern that the US withdrawal from its global leadership role, including its withdrawal from the World Health Organization and health research funding, will seriously affect global health issues. Some people warn of a coming global health crisis. What's your opinion on that? And you've worked extensively in developing countries. You've been in the field even recently, if I am correctly. So, could you describe us what is going on there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Konstantinos. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers of the Delphi Economic Forum for giving me the opportunity to speak. If you allow me, let's go back 5 years in time. COVID pandemic. That was an absolute accidental breakdown of health systems worldwide. Let's remember the numbers. 7 million deaths that we know of, probably closer to 20 million. Close to 16 billion in economic losses. 1.6 billion children were not allowed to go to school. 130 million people were pushed into poverty into that period of 1.5 years. So we all lived this together. You remember this. And you know the question that we were all asking at the time. How do we make sure that this never happens again? So we are now 5 years later. What is the lesson learned? Apparently none. So after January 20th, the Trump administration announced immediately that they were withdrawing from the WHO. So this is not going to take effect immediately. It will take 1 year to take effect. So in fact, it will be January 2026. But the United States is the single largest funder of the WHO, $1.28 billion. That's 15% of its annual budget. So right now, the WHO is bracing for a reduction in its workforce between 20 and 40% worldwide. And the US has started an incredibly bad trend, because they are now no longer the only ones who have reduced their foreign aid. A lot of European countries are following suit. The United Kingdom is decreasing its foreign aid to 0.3% of GDP. Their contribution to the Global Vaccine Initiative, Gavi, from 0.7% to 0.5%. And Trump is following by saying, we will completely withdraw from Gavi in 2025. So on the domestic side, it's also very bad. Trump has cut a lot of funding, which has meant layoff in key institutions in health, Health and Human Services, NIH, CDC, FDA. I can't even give you the numbers because they keep changing every day. In the United Kingdom, very, very worrisome. Half of the workforce of the NHS will be cut in 2025. So what does that mean? Half of the workforce. What does that mean? It means that there are going to be disastrous consequences, both domestically and internationally, on patient care, on life-saving research, but also on our ability to track and fight infectious diseases. So you were asking me, if I still have time, about the impact it has on low and middle-income countries. So let me put this in 4 quick categories. The workforce. Tens of thousands of nurses, lab techs, and doctors have already lost their jobs in low and middle-income countries. Very concrete example, Uganda, a country of 48 million people. They just lost 3,000 doctors out of their 10,000 total for 48 million. In HIV, UNAIDS is predicting that the cuts will lead to 6 million unnecessary deaths by 2030. In tuberculosis, again, the US is the single largest funder, $250 million per year. USAID contributes or helps prevent over 3 million deaths every year. So without their funding, we are worried about what's going to happen. Increase of TB transmission, increase of MDR TB transmission. Malaria, 15 million new cases, 100,000 preventable deaths. So if I may conclude with the words of a colleague from Brown, there is a massive fire happening right now, and we are dismantling every single fire station.
Okay. So let me move on to Mr. Van Duin. So one important pillar through which we formulate responses to risks is risk-sharing services. You had an impressive career in leadership positions in the insurance industry for over 30 years, right? So how resilient is the sector against the double challenge of climate change and health threats?
Yeah, maybe it's nice to add a positive note to what we've heard already, but I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure. You're fully right. You know, we see an accumulation of serious risks, and when I focus on climate and health primarily, and you talk about the resilience of the insurance industry, I would say, basically spoken, in more mature markets, the insurance industry is quite robust. You know, we have a capital-based system. It's highly regulated. Accounting rules are more or less similar. So I would say all the impact we see of all kind of crises, the insurance industry will probably be able to survive by just adjusting to the situation. The issue is what happens if, as a result of these kind of natural catastrophes or claims, insurance becomes unaffordable or reinsurance is not anymore available. Then, in the end, it ends on the plate of the end customer, so it will be on the plate of society. So, and that, I would say, gives the biggest concern to all of us, and that on top of what all the nice things we already heard, it's not a very pleasant situation. And then actually completely different if you look at the health situation, apart from the disasters you've spoken about, and my foundation where I've been involved is a company, business foundation, already received requests to fill the gap, which by the way is practically impossible. But we were looking at it. But in the general health insurance situation, it's a different situation. We have to realize that nowhere in the world health insurance systems are the same. You always have to modify for local situations. But in general, if you look at, on top of all the issues we already have, increasing population, more technology, chronic diseases, outdated healthcare provider systems, if you look at that, budget cuts by governments, in the end, we will only see that more and more people can't buy their basic health insurance, are not covered, and the accumulation of various risks like climate and health, if that accumulates at the level of the society and of the consumers, and that will lead to, let's say, in an already polarized world, that will lead to more and more dissatisfaction. So that will increase instability. So I think if you look at the various types of crises, and which now we name Polycrises, I'm very much afraid that it will lead to more and more inequality in the world, and that is a big issue in itself if you want stability.
So let me turn to Mrs. Gregori now. The EU has seen its fair share of recent crises, also in your field. What lessons have we learned from these past crises regarding, among other factors, the interconnection of crises in the same field or the accumulation of crises? And does the EU now possess the necessary mechanisms to address a new crisis, also considering the shifts that we witness today?
Thank you very much, Konstantinos, for this question. And of course, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting European Union Agency for Asylum. We have a quite, let's say, limited mandate. Of course, we only deal indeed with asylum matters, so not with migration management on the level of EU as such. And we are indeed an organization that is, of course, not a political organization, but in our existence, we are a fairly new organization, so we exist since 2010. We have indeed met, we've been met with a situation that we can't call them crises, obviously. But I would want to point out that from our perspective, of course, preparedness is very important. Let me just give you two examples. You all might remember migration crisis since 2015. 2015, when indeed 1.4 million asylum seekers have come in European Union. Most of them, they were marching through the Western Balkans, of course, coming to European Union. At that time, we all need to admit, and that was already, of course, acknowledged already 2015 and 16, that, of course, European Union has not been ready and prepared. We didn't have proper coordination mechanisms. Of course, the legislation was also, in a way, not in a way prepared for this kind of a huge volume, of course, of people. Reception conditions have been put, registration didn't work, and so on. But then, on the other hand, if I may point out to a be a bit of a more positive story. In 2012, when aggression to Ukraine started, Europe was much more ready. Of course, there were more than 4 million people that came from Ukraine. We were able, of course, to activate so-called temporary protection directive, and obviously member states were ready to register, were ready to admit Ukrainians and others coming from Ukraine. And of course, this was much more coordinated, so the approach was completely different. And I think that what we've learned from that threat, of course, the European Commission proposed now the so-called Pact on Migration and Asylum. And some of the components from, let's say, the crisis of 15 and then the situation of 2022 have now emerged in the new legislation. And I do believe that for the future, if, of course, member states will be in position to implement properly this new legislation, we'll be able to indeed have better insight in what is happening. So the forecasting should definitely be better. The European Commission is now preparing annual forward-looking analysis on the basis of annual reports. Solidarity potentially might, of course, be also there to be used. And you will also have uniform screening procedures, and asylum and border procedures, return procedures should enhance. So there are tools on the table now that indeed might prevent or might help us with dealing with potential future crises. And just to emphasize what, of course, distinguished panelists have mentioned, there will be an effect, of course, of US actions when it comes to support of United Nations agencies, especially UNHCR and IOM, because indeed they've pulled out or frozen now 40% of their budget. So this might have an effect also on European Union when we talk about migration management.
Thank you. So let's speed up things a bit in the second round. Shifting gears a bit, let me turn to Mr. Ben Amor. When we talk about polycrisis, the elephant in the room is technology. In the next few years, AI would lead to transformation of huge scale, carrying across sectors and fields. Do you think that we're putting enough emphasis on this? Have we developed the necessary tools for this?
So if I depressed you in my first answer, I'm going to actually switch gear and be very optimistic. I am a very, very big enthusiast of AI. I'm leading an AI and Future of Work initiative at Columbia that Professor Cooley is also part of. And I'm going to shorten my answer for the Greek context. For those of you who are worried, by the way, that your job is going to be replaced by artificial intelligence in the next 5 to 10 years, don't worry. That's not the problem. Your job is going to be replaced by a human complemented by artificial intelligence while you stay with the skills that you have. So that's something to be thinking about. The landscape is going to evolve. That's totally normal. The good news is that all the studies that have looked at how AI is impacting loss of job and creation of job typically has a net gain. And that's because there are new jobs that we can't even think about that will be created in the next 5-10 years. Think about prompt writer. It's a new category of job that didn't exist 3 years ago, okay? So really the focus should be on reskilling and upskilling and making sure that your workforce stays motile, and able to adapt. Talking about the Greek context. So I think that the world is a little bit polarized right now between those who have the funding to invest in AI infrastructure and those who don't. But there's a second level. Those who believe that artificial intelligence is transformational and those who don't. So where are the Greeks in this polarization? So this morning I attended a session on future of work in Greece, and they released questionnaire to C-level executives. So that's your CEO, CFO, CTOs. And one of the questions that was asked is, do you believe that AI will increase productivity of your workers? 24% of the Greek CEOs said no, and 57% said less than 10%. So, ladies and gentlemen, 75% of your CEOs do not believe that AI is transformational. What does that tell you about the investments that the private sector is going to do? So the question you should be asking yourself is, how does the government think about that, and how does academia help? So I had examples, but I can see that the clock is running.
I guess you have a lot of them. So let me turn to Mr. Cooley. So during the last few years, we've seen a crisis denial trend growing. Yeah. Climate change denial, vaccine denial. even more recently, elementary economic, democratic, or foreign policy axioms denial, which leads to aggravating the different states of crisis. How can we handle this problem in Europe?
Right. So all of the basic pillars of the Polycrisis are pillars themselves that the U.S. government has wanted to disassociate and extricate themselves from in terms of their international obligations, right? The Paris Treaty, certainly we see this in terms of maintaining an open economic system, now with the recourse of tariffs, the cuts in U.S. aid and contributions to global health, which was roughly about 1/3. So all of the elements are there, plus I would even say on the migration and refugee issue, recoding it and reframing it not as an issue of the Polycrisis, but as a hard security issue, right? That's how it's being sort of reframed. So the question is, can you convince this government, can you convince half of the American people that these are things that are worth doing? And the answer is actually, I don't think you can, right? So then what's left? What's the alternative? The alternative is to think about different kinds of networks and coalitions, right? If you can't scale an ally with the federal government, then consider allying with a state, right, that does want to govern and change these things, that does want to be part of international standards setting, that does want to send experts and be part of working groups, right? A state like California, a state like Michigan. Think about city-to-city contacts. Think about civil society contacts. Yes, of course, government to government is one of the most important drivers of change, but let's think about the different kinds of scaling transnational coalitions we can make to address these important challenges.
Okay, so let me turn to Mr. Van Duin. As a famous saying goes, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. Do you think that we can bring out some kind of opportunity in the current context? And do we have today the visionary, the necessary leadership, both in politics and in business, that could grasp such an opportunity, if there is any?
Or in other words, never waste a good crisis, they say. So, no, I think in every crisis there are opportunities, and what's now happening in the geopolitical situation, without being a politician, by the way, I see a big opportunity that alliances like the European Union really become more and more unified. Even it's fine for me if it's just a coalition of the willing, because if you all want to align all the member states, it's a big issue. But I also think it's quite positive that you see new alliances arise in order to address, let's say, the negative developments we see all over the world. So it's actually quite positive to see what's happening in a reaction to further stabilize the current situation. And if I look at the political climate, I see a lot of, and you said it before, short-term views, looking at the next election, maintaining in power. So it's not, it doesn't feel to me as people wanting to make a contribution on the long term to support society, which is very, very necessary at the moment. So at the same time, you can look in the mirror and ask yourself, where does it then needs to come from? And I think it's also an opportunity, and I'm from the business community, it's also an opportunity to use the current situation to make a call upon the business leadership to step in and we've seen many businesses have overcome many, let's say, political ups and downs and what have you. So I think there's a big responsibility also for the business communities to step in and to overcome this short-term approach. And you could argue whether, let's say, the politicians are part of the solution or part of the problem. So if that's the question, then let's also make a call to the business environment to step in. So that would be my approach, and in the end you need to be in discussion with each other. So I'm quite happy to see that the European Union postponed the reaction of countermeasures against the trade tariffs introduced by Mr. Trump. For me, as a more or less rational thinking person, it's quite difficult to understand what's happening, and I fear that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think there's a big opportunity for the business and environment to also pick up the responsibility.
Okay. So, Mrs. Gregori, we're once again reaching record numbers of displaced persons around the world. At the same time, we live in times where asylum and migration are increasingly polarized, both at the level of domestic and international politics. So how do policy making and policy implementation in your field deal with this dynamic? And how can it keep up with developments? What is the influence of public perceptions and narratives in this context?
Yeah, I think that's a very challenging question. I think that, I mean, there are some points where you could say that our member states, or the population, the member states, but also politicians, wants to see that migration, when it comes to Europe, is manageable, is predictable, and is in a way also sustainable. Because of course we have gaps in the labor market, we need to address those, and this needs to be manageable. I mentioned PACT before, I will not go back to that, but I think that there are crucial questions still on the table when it comes to European Union and management of migration, namely, how do we properly organize entry into the European Union? And then also, how do we properly organize exit or return from the European Union? PACT is there to address these things, I would say, technically, but of course there will need to be obviously a cooperation with partner countries, of course with third countries, where we will need to speed up those processes, linked, of course, migration will be linked with other things that, of course, we discuss with partner countries in the European Union. And I think from the perspective of our organization, I would just state that, of course, credibility of the system is crucial. Because if you don't have the credibility in the system that you are creating or that you have to manage, then of course you fail on many aspects. So the credibility is crucial for the asylum seekers, which are coming to the European Union, to be aware, of course, whether they will get an asylum or not already in advance. So this, I think, is something that we really fail as the European Union quite often. But then this credibility of the system is also very important, for our own citizens, right? They deserve, because they are payers, they deserve to have a system which is obviously functioning, and the system which can, in a way, have fast and efficient procedures that, in a way, will grant international protection to those who are in need of the protection. And we see statistically, of course, that there are 43% of those who are coming to the European Union and eligible for international protection, while more than 60% are not. So I think that's quite a crucial momentum, and we will see how this will develop further on.
Okay, so we don't have much time left. I have, one last question. I would like a very short comment from each one of you. According to a widespread belief, since the cause of the phenomenon of polycrisis is the deep and multi-phased interconnection of our global world, the proper response should be isolation, a sort of global disconnection, instead of multilateral collaboration and cooperation. What's your take on that? Let's start with Mr. Benamor.
I am absolutely against isolationism. As a species, us human beings, we do so much better when we collaborate with each other rather than when we fight each other. I'm going to give you an example in public health that not a lot of people know. At the height of the Cold War, when USSR and the United States were front fighting with nuclear rhetoric, in the background you had the scientists, Russian scientists and American scientists, who were actually trying to eradicate smallpox. And they managed to do that in 1977. Last case in Ethiopia, WHO declared it eradicated in 1980. And to this day, it is the only disease we managed to eradicate on this planet. You can look at the human body as an example. The brain doesn't work by itself. The heart doesn't work by itself. None of the organs work by itself. It only works when it's a total,
Yeah.
Do you know what happens when cells try to work independently? It's called cancer.
So, Mrs. Gregori.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to migration, I think preparedness is the key. It's very difficult. Of course, obviously, because nobody has a crystal ball, and there are emerging situations, geopolitically speaking, basically as we speak. So in this respect, it's really hard to address, of course, the situation when indeed you can have a polycrisis due to the fact that you cannot influence. But still, gathering proper information and then obviously preparing for are potential situations that you call crisis, of course, that's in our field of work quite critical.
Mr. Van Duin?
Yeah, I fully concur. You know, we live in an international world, and it's absolutely insane to think that isolation, which by the way leads to protection, can help us in whatever way. What we need, I think, when it comes to insurance, it can make, and it has proven to support solidarity. And I think if we can organize solidarity so in order that everybody can participate in society, I think that's a big asset we should protect.
Mr. Cooley?
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And wearing my research dean hat, I would also put in a plug to realize there is a red alarm fire going on right now in terms of this ecosystem of facts, of knowledge and research that we took for granted would always be publicly available on the net for anyone, and we are losing this. We are losing this quickly, and so we need to come up with strategies, whether it be at the government level or even the private sector level, certain at the foundation level, to make sure to preserve the data that we have, the research that we have, and think about new ways to safeguard and make these truly publicly available to enable the reconstitution of some of these international networks.
Okay, it appears that we've reached the end. Let's wrap it up. Thank you all.